Thanks for joining us again. Welcome back to the Talking Leadership TV Best Practice Network podcast series. Today we head back to co-hosted podcasts, and I'm looking forward to sharing the discussion I had with my co-host Kevin Bennett and our guest Clint Strahan regarding accountability and leadership. Thank you for joining us. Kevin is the Queensland and New South Wales facilitator for the Best Practice Network. They have members across Australia, New Zealand and Vietnam. Their mantra is inspire to challenge, support to succeed. The Best Practice Network facilitates a range of activities, events and online forums to connect like-minded organisations to fast-track their performance through shared learning, expertise, experience and resources. Improving the knowledge of best practice and developing leadership capabilities at the core of everything the network provides for its members. Kevin has held operational leadership roles across many sectors and industries. He's got a passion for continuous improvement and lifelong learning, with a focus on developing capabilities of the many teams he's worked with. Our guest today is Clint Strahan. Clint spent the first 10 years of his career at university studying the hard sciences, including biology, chemistry and maths, and then moved to the softer science of psychology. It was the study of people and business that Clint found fascinating, and he could see the potential to really help people and businesses to do better. For the last 10 years, he's worked in senior leadership roles and as a consultant, with the aim always being to learn, experiment, help businesses and the people within them to grow and to perform at their best. When he's not working, you'll find him spending his time with his family, providing free labour on the family cattle property, surfing, fishing and enjoying the outdoors of the Sunshine Coast. Thank you for joining us for this podcast. I know you'll enjoy it, but enough from me. I'll hand over to Kevin and our guest, Clint Strahan.
Hello and welcome back to this Talking Leadership Best Practice Network podcast series. Looking forward to a great topic today. So my name is Kevin. I'm part of the Best Practice Network in New South Wales and Queensland, and we cover the whole of New Zealand and Australia. So looking forward to this series. I know it's proved very popular with our members. I'd like to introduce Clint. Clint, good morning. How are you?
Mate, living the dream, Kevin. Thank you.
Fantastic. So Clint's joining us today, and we're going to talk about this leadership thing called accountability. And I know, Eric, how are you?
I'm good, Kevin. How are you? How are you, Clint?
Yeah,
living the dream, boys.
So this leadership topic of accountability. So Clint and I managed to catch up the other day. So Clint, do you just want to quickly just give people a brief update just on where you are today and why you think this is such a key topic for us?
Yep, for sure, Kevin. Thanks. I'm coming to you from the very sunny, beautiful Sunshine Coast today. And look, the topic of accountability is one that I've been sort of almost banging on about for about 10 years. So very dear to my heart. It's one of those topics around leadership that I just think doesn't get enough airtime. So I love talking about it. And my background's organisational psychology, so I suppose I approach it from that angle.
Great. So let's just start to get the discussion going. So I'm also interested, Eric, how many podcasts are you up to now, mate?
Over 220, and the bulk of them were the audio podcasts. And now that I've switched to video, it's up the game a little bit. And look, if I'm being honest, I always aimed for the podcast to be about the guest. So with the video version, having you guys up on the screen sort of hits what I want to do. So I want people to learn from the guests rather than me waxing lyrical about what I think leadership is, because it's an argument you're never going to win, and I'm not geared that way. So over 220, mate, and I'm hoping to hit around 260, maybe 270 by the end of this year.
Yeah, fantastic. And we're obviously looking forward to being part of that 260 and onwards and upwards.
Yeah, well, you guys have contributed a good chunk of that, so very appreciative, mate.
That's all right. So, all right, accountability, Clint. Let's just get some feeling around this, because it does come across as one of these about, it's easy to say, but obviously you understand how we got to follow that through over time. So give us in your view, and then we'll bounce that around. If someone say, Clint, I don't understand what this accountability thing is. I'm a leader in a business. How would you just summarize it for us?
Well, there's a bit to it, Kevin, but I'll maybe start with there's two main reactions people have when you say the word accountability. One is, where's this going? That whole blame and punishment thing. And then the other, you get people leaning forwards going, yeah, this is a thing, help me understand it more. And that's probably why I like the topic, because it's a little more edgy. And when someone asks me about it, I make the point very first up. It's like, when we're not talking about blame and punishment, because that's not useful, that's not constructive. I think about accountability as sort of a mature concept. So it's about setting really clear expectations with people. It's about providing feedback. And the bit that makes people uncomfortable is the follow through on consequences. It's you need all of those three things for accountability to work.
And just another question, is that only downwards? So in an organization, is that just me going, I'm the leader, I want you to do this, you're not doing it very well, or you are doing it very well, and here's the next thing. So is it just a one-way thing, this accountability?
Oh, look, nothing's ever one way in leadership, but I think the approach changes depending on your audience, right? So if you're a leader and we're talking about setting expectations, you'd logically assume that's going downwards, but you can absolutely set expectations, which are essentially boundaries, upwards or sidewards as well.
That's an interesting one, I think, because you've the sidewards as well, because sidewards suddenly means and invariably in an organization, I don't have this this structure or this authority sidewards to set expectations, give this feedback. So is that an area that you find is a bit of a gap in people's understanding as well? I can get the vertical up and down. What about the sideways?
Well, I think it comes, the key word you mentioned there is, formal authority. And I talk a lot about that with leaders, because often leaders almost rely on that formal authority to justify doing some of that stuff. And the discussion I normally have is, you don't need formal authority to build relationships, to set boundaries, to talk to people and give them feedback at all. And the really good leaders, I think, really understand that, and that helps them navigate and create, stronger relationships with people.
Yeah. So I'm interested now, because obviously accountability has been around for a while, like a lot of these leadership terms and phrases. Do you feel it's more, it matters more now? Is there something that's triggering this? I mean, Eric and I, we've done a number of these, and accountability comes up and resilience comes up and everything else. But the accountability one, I think I may have mentioned to you when we met, it's one of those words that just seem to have popped up recently, just in terms of conversation. So why do you think that is, and why does it seem to matter? Why are we talking about it today?
Yeah, look, I suppose there's two parts to that. I think it's one of those perennial issues. It never goes away. It's always there. So I got interested in it 15 years ago. So that was the topic of my PhD, and it was really interesting because you go and start to read and look around, and it was mentioned everywhere. So global companies, BHP, Coca-Cola, Starbucks, all these big companies, they'll have it as a company value. But then when I started to go a bit deeper and look into, well, okay, great, it seems important. What research is there? And there was not much. So I think it's definitely, like, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot. I think there's an intuitive understanding that it's important. But there's not a lot of clarity around what it means, and then what does it mean in practice as well for leaders and for businesses. But then I think probably more recently, I think it's coming up more and more because of the economic climate. Basically, I think talent shortages. Businesses are trying to do lots and they're struggling for talent, and I think they're thinking about, well, how do we get the most out of the resources that we've got? And in that sort of environment, things like accountability start to rise up again.
That's it. And again, I think you're prompting some thoughts here, which is why we love doing these, Eric. So I think that where we can struggle sometimes, accountability can be this negative control thing. Yeah, it's a way of managing. Yeah, I'm holding you accountable, Eric, to get to 300 by December. If you don't, then I'm going to tell you off, and consequences and everything else. So when you were doing your PhD, and congratulations on doing that, I feel left out now because I haven't done one. how do we how do we now use it to drive improvement and drive performance or drive personal and business improvement? So, because I think there's something we've got to draw out here is about this can actually be a really positive tool if done in the right way.
Yeah, yep. So look, I tend to think about it in two ways, and most of my work is with leaders. So, working with individuals or teams of leaders around this topic. And for them, I go back to that sort of simple framework around how do you set expectations with people? And there's a bit to that, right? And, that's not always crystal clear. And the skills that leaders need to be able to do that. I always talk to them about feedback and how you provide feedback. And, there's lots of models and frameworks around how to have those conversations, but it's, critical that they happen. And then the consequences part. I always talk about, a hierarchy of consequences and, how do you manage your own emotions and approach to that stuff so that, it doesn't get away from you. And so it's a lot of work with leaders around how do you do all that effectively as a leader, as an individual. And then the other side is, when you're talking to more senior teams, particularly, it's like they're thinking less about just themselves and their own approach, but they're thinking about the business. How do we, build this stuff in and integrate it, scale it so that it makes a real impact. And then you start getting into, first of all, what are the expectations you've set with your leaders and the business and the culture around, performance and feedback and all these things. But it inevitably also goes to things like, what's your performance management system? Do you have one? Is it doing what you want it to do? And same with performance management and consequences, that end of things. Do you have a formal approach that you want people to understand and to follow? And do you have some of those fundamentals in place? So there's kind of the two parts. There's the individual leader and how they approach it, and how mature they are, and then what are the business setups and structures that also support a culture of accountability.
I have some observations to share if I can, Kevin and Clint. Now, in terms of accountability frameworks, and I'm fascinated to maybe get at your PhD to read what you wrote and what people were saying. But one thing around the structure of accountability, I see that waxing and waning when it comes to board and board structures, because there are governance principle sets about how boards do their job, and advisory boards are another subset of that provide some frameworks within the business at a meta, that strategic level. But within the business, everything you're talking about, I can't disagree. One thing that I found interesting, and I met Jonathan Mamerel through Kevin and through the network, about what are your frameworks in the business to deal with legal matters, employment matters, and what are those accountability frameworks? Because the one thing that is interesting to me as a student of human beings, not just leadership, is you can set every accountability framework you want, but if people don't buy in or they don't give a crap about the framework, they're not going to engage. So the idea that there's a consequence for not doing that, I think goes far above and beyond command and control. And we're really looking at, how do you set expectations for normal human behavior in the workplace that is specific to that workplace, and also ticks off on all of these regulatory issues that you've got to be thinking about in your environment. I hate to go there, Clint, but I think there's some very big gray areas here that people skirt in and out of. And if you have no framework for how to deal with what accountability mechanisms look like in your business, and or you don't enforce them, then you end up stepping in big piles of what as you go along when you're trying to run your business. Is that fair comment, mate?
Yeah, look, it is 100% fair. And to be honest, I don't love getting into that space around formal mechanisms, because in my head that's mostly compliance stuff. Yeah, you've got to have it. Does it drive like high performance? No. You got to have it. It's like supporting stuff, and that's why I naturally gravitate way to more towards working with leaders, because I think that's your lever, right? If you can't get your leaders, having the conversations and doing the the soft skill stuff, doesn't matter how many compliance frameworks you've got, mechanisms you've got.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I don't mean one is more important than the other. I think the two live in a state of dissonance because they exist. And no, I wouldn't want to be around leaders that just work around the frameworks and do this or consequence. But there's a reality to how businesses operate, and where there's breaches of what an accountability is, whether it's formal or informal, you still have to recognize that they're important. And I can bet, and I think I would win this, that each of us and those that are watching this have met people that skirt the line or break the rules and don't give a flying, they don't care because they don't think there's going to be a consequence. Where I think what you're talking about, and I'm in solid agreement here, is if we create an environment where people are allowed to talk, have difficult conversations, make mistakes, and learn from those things, that's where I think you're playing. And it's both interest me because they intersect at some points, and I get why you're not interested in the more formal stuff. So sorry, Kevin, over to you, mate.
No, I think it's, again, this is a good opportunity for me to take some thought, but I think this is why I really want to go back to that there is this point about if someone acted unsafely, in work, you'd pick them up, and you'd be having a chat with them to say, hang on a minute, and there can be the very hard, you should have been wearing your PPE, or you should have been doing this, and you can talk about the consequences. And I think that's where a lot of leaders feel safe, because it's a tangible thing. I can pull out a document, I can pull out a procedure, and I know to deal with it. So, and then you say to people, so, okay, why did you do that? And they go, well, it's obvious, because if I don't go and talk to them and if I don't go and pick them up this unsafe, we could have an accident, which could impact the business. So there's a very logical I want to go and hold them for that. And they can also very quickly go into the fact they go, yeah, but I don't want them to be hurt either, because there's consequences for them. So when you talk to a lot of leaders and managers, and again, we've had a big chat about what leadership is and what management is, it's very easy to do this accountability in the management phase, the management of, I'm holding you accountable to deliver a job, or I'm managing you, or that control into being safe at work. So when you talk to managers and leaders like that, they go, it's obvious, of course I do it. And then you go, so why didn't you do it over here then? And there's almost this, because I'm now out of my comfort zone here, because I haven't got a document, I haven't got a stick, I haven't got a that. So, and that's the bit I think we need to explore here, because to say, look, we do this naturally in a lot of cases, and why do we struggle? And as I know, so why do we struggle to do it when we want to just get people to get better and get people to do things better? Now, I see you smiling there, Clint, so I'm going to hand back to you there.
I've had some good thoughts while you're talking. I think there's a few things going on. I think in the example you gave around safety, we've done a lot of training. The world has matured a lot in that space, and it's like a pretty clear point A to point B. Like the steps are pretty easy to follow. Everything's pretty clear. I think, you talk about that difference between management and leadership. I think managers will approach the accountability stuff again, like you said. It's like, oh, there's something that needs addressing, I'll address it, here's a consequence or an outcome or whatever, but they'll approach it in the A to B way. I think leaders go into that stuff with the assumption that they don't know everything. Yes, they can recognize something, but they go in with more curiosity rather than, X, Y, Z, I've told you you've done something wrong. I've pulled you up on it. There we go, done. I think leaders just approach it differently. It's a different mindset. So curiosity and probably a more positive focus. I think the really good leaders are always looking for, how do I help this person grow or get better, or and help the team and help the business. They're balancing all those competing priorities. So I think there's a shift there, and I kind of always go back to that. The association of accountability with blame and punishment is not useful. It's just not the way to do it. It's about letting people know where they stand, giving them the feedback they need, and deliver it in the way that you got to understand the individual a bit, right? Yeah. How to interact with them. But there's absolutely got to be some clear boundaries.
Would there be a different outcome, Clint? And I'll put this to my co-host here, Kevin, as well, because you've both been around the world of work as long, and some of you longer than me, dealing with other human beings, is looking at that delineation between those that we identify in the business as leaders and those that we identify in the management role because they're more operationally focused. Do you think we would have a different organizational culture climate if we started looking at our managers as leaders that have an operational focus, that when you label someone in the management sphere, that immediately they don't do the functions of the leaders above them in that have more a strategic role within the business? So what I'm starting to hear from conversations and where my thinking has been challenged on this is, you look at your middle level and upper level management, they're all leaders. They're just focusing on different aspects of the leadership function. So some will do more operational and some will do more strategic. And I think we would have very different conversations around accountability if that mind shift was there. And I'm not for a second thinking that that's the same across all organizations. But if I'm hearing you right, and I'm hearing Kevin right, I think this is a perspectives and scene setting thing, and creating relationships in the business rather than being reliant just on where you sit on the totem pole.
Yeah.
I think the level of business that go through, I think, and again, we've come in discussion that I think as you go up through the hierarchy, you've got this operational role that you deal with. That's very clear and is usually quite well set out. So I think I've just got to do this by this. I've got to do this by this. You've got your KPIs, you've got your boards, you've got your metrics, you've got your processes. As that comes up, it gets a little bit more fuzzy. Not quite. It becomes a little bit more, deliver the day and everything else. And I think this is where people begin to struggle. Yeah, because and we've always talked about this. A good manager, and we said this before, a good manager will not become a good leader because they were a good manager. Yeah, because it's about but you've got to be able to transition or be able to see an opportunity where you've got to step into that space if you're working with teams and go, can I just give you some feedback, Clint? You're great here, and have you thought about this? And maybe we've got to do that. But it's definitely one of those, this corporate things is when you're going on that leadership management journey, it's the very hard stuff. Be safe, be legal, and they train you around that. Yeah, and that's where you become comfortable. Once you start to go out of that, then that's where you become more uncomfortable. And I think this is why, and I'm going to come to Clint in a minute, is how do we start to do this now? What's the framework and everything else? And I think it's a big challenge at the minute because the way the business climate is at the minute, and we've talked a lot about where we come from. It's very dynamic at the minute. Things are coming at us as quick as anything else. And we've also got this one eye on what's next. If I get up in the morning, do I really want to turn on the news? Because I don't know what's going to hit me and how it's going to impact me. And our ability, I think, to use this process to improve as well and have good conversations, I think is what's maybe lacking in a lot of businesses at the minute, because I can't go this is what 9 till 5 looks like. And I think it's that ability to have those conversations. So I think this is why this is a very interesting one at the moment. Clint, and your views?
Yeah. Look, I think this is where you guys are going. You're talking about, which in my mind is one of the fundamental challenges of businesses these days. How do we grow our leaders? That's where we're going. How do we get them, to grow and mature and take a bigger view and operate in a world that's more complex than it's ever been? And I've got some views about it, and I think, firstly, it's hard. If it was easy,
Yep.
we'd all be doing it. And it happens, for each individual a bit differently. But there's probably some common components, I reckon, to helping leaders grow. One is they don't know what they don't know. So I think in order to grow, you need to take some things that were probably unconscious and make them conscious. And that happens through feedback. If a leader just hasn't had the feedback themselves, how do they know where to grow and what to work on? And I've done a lot of reading about sort of adult development and change, Carl Jung stuff on the process of individuation the last few years, because I'm really interested in the process. How do people grow and change and, move away from, established patterns and thoughts that they've kind of built up that they think serve them, but probably don't if they want to grow and, do more and, have the conversations and deal with more complexity and all of those things. And that's we're getting into tricky technical stuff there. It's not easy. I think most businesses tackle it with leadership programs and that sort of thing. And, that's good. I think there's got to be some sort of scalable approach to it. But like I said, I think it's got to be based on, some some feedback, some self-assessment at the start to help people identify what are your gaps, what do you need to work on.
Yeah. And again, and I'm going to come back to the point about you can see that downwards. There's still this upward management that needs to happen, because I think there's part of this is we don't want the nodding donkey, the smiling face, yeah boss, and walk away. There's got to be this and I think we'll get to it, this culture we've got to build where it's okay for me to go back up to Eric and say, I know you said that, but it's not clear, or is it the right thing to do? Yeah. Or the way it came across was, and if we do that, Eric, there's consequences here that, for the business. And that's why I think we need to explore a little bit about this whole upwards and backwards. It's got to be a two-way process. Because otherwise, how does Eric know that I've really understood everything if I'm not feeding back what I'm feeling and what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing? Otherwise he thinks one thing. He thinks I'm off to go and make grey sweets, and I'm off to make yellow sweets because I thought that's what he said. So I think it's an important part, and it's this, and it can be quite iterative. And I think this is again why it can be why people struggle with it, because it's not the clear do A, B, C. It could be, well, I've seen this, or have you thought about this? And it may take a couple of iterations before we get to it. And that's where I think a lot of leaders they either do it instinctively. So are they leaders born or made? I think there's a lot of people who can do this naturally because it's their styles. But I think there's still a lot of leaders who say, well, because when you start to talk through these things, it may not always be clear, and you may have to have two-way feedback. That's where we start to struggle with it. That's where we start to and it's how do we grow the leaders, as you say, that it's okay. This is part of the leadership process. It's part of building you as well as it's building your team. So is there again within is there something that you could just some very quick process or framework, Clint, you can just talk us through without just generally because people are listening and watching here, and I'm sure that we're making some notes. But if I'm sitting here go, right, I want to go and try something after this podcast, is there just some quick tips or process framework you can take us through?
Again, I hope I don't go too long with this, but I thought of two ways to think about that question there, Kevin. And as you were talking about, a leader sitting there and, being able to sort of influence and build relationships down as well as up, I start thinking, well, what does that person need to be like to be able to do that effectively? And what they need is they need to have a mature sense of self. Because the reason they're struggling with it is their own anxiety. That's what it is. It's like, I'm uncomfortable having that conversation up or sideways or down or whatever it is. But that's their own anxiety, which is really normal, because human beings are social animals. We're hardwired to want to belong. That's built into us, because if you didn't, 1,000 years ago, if you didn't belong, you were out, you were dead. So it's pretty important. We're hardwired to belong and to fit into sort of hierarchies and structures. That's just kind of the way it is. But not everyone operates like that. A fair chunk of the adult population, that's their driver of behavior and belief, is the need to belong. There's a chunk, a decent chunk of the adult population that can develop that more independent sense of self. I call it sort of like the self-determined style of thinking, or self-determined mind, and it's someone's ability to take an independent position and not be so caught up with what everyone thinks. And then, the very, very, very good leaders can even step back a little further than that and not be so attached to their own identity as well. We talk about, the kind of the wise strategic leader. And how do you get people to shift? The practical stuff. I think you start with, like I said sort of earlier, you got to look at what are your own beliefs? What's holding you back? What are your fears? If I have this conversation, what might happen? They won't like me. If I'm going down, they'll quit. Whatever those fears are, write them down and then challenge them. Do a little experiment. Do something a little different to push your boundary a bit and go, well, actually, is that fear true? If I have that conversation with my boss, it's a bit uncomfortable for me. Is he now not going to like me and not promote me or whatever the thing is? Probably not. Probably if you have the conversation, he'll go, oh, geez, that was good, and has a bit more respect for you. That's probably the outcome. But I think it's each person's different, right? But it's always looking for what's that little way I can challenge myself a bit, push myself a bit further, and explore some of those, those natural and very normal fears and anxieties that I've got.
Yeah, no, and I think it's an interesting. So then we go into the role of the leader, coaching and mentoring as well. That leads into the just not what I've got to do now, but there's also how do I build my team as well? This process to say this is how I'm coaching you to to take on more things or delivering what you do, or ultimately be part of the succession plan. So I think we've got to be clear that it's part of this process, which is about building our own personal capability, because the more we do this, the better leader we become. But it's also a great way to build your people and your teams as well, because the level of understanding, being able to have the hard conversations sometimes, and that culture of being able to do this in a fairly open and honest way, because we can get feedback, but is it any good? No, it's just do we really talk about the consequence? I'll go back to the safety element. It is a little bit easier to say, well, the consequences are we have an accident at work, but let's understand the consequences of what that accident would mean for you back at your home, or would it impact the business longer term, and just being able to have those type of conversations. So it's I think we want to go, I want to read the book that says this is how I do accountability, and it goes bang 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 bang. We know that doesn't happen, but it's I think, as you said, it's almost we've got to do it as a process, a learning process, improvement process. And okay, the fact it may not go the way you thought it did is a good thing, because it means you've got to learn and understand. And so it's again, I'm more thinking about the accountability. It can be this improvement tool on a whole different level as well, just not that controlling accountability. But I see it in my mind. I'm listening to it as a development or an improvement skill as well. Is that something you've seen?
Yeah, that's exactly the way I think about it. It's you went over a bit there, Kevin, and I was sort of thinking two things. It was one that I think where we're going was, as leaders, we're going to be working on ourselves, because as we do that, we learn more. Then we better equipped and better able to coach and mentor others, for sure.
I love the phrase you said about, let's create this culture, because again, it can't just be a one person thing here. We've all got to start doing it and holding each other accountable. So I know you said about, we need to start having our own little thoughts. Okay, I'm about to have this conversation. What could it mean? And there's a lot of talk around that leader standard work about getting into habits and routines, about that type of thing. Have you got any little tips or things about just, I want to make start tomorrow, is what sort of routines, habits do I have to get into? And does it have to, I suppose my other comment is, what's the mixture between formal and informal here as well? Because some of it can be quite structured and planned, but I would imagine there'd be this informal, off the cuff stuff. So I haven't had the time to think about it. I've got to deal with it now.
I think you're 100% right there, Kevin. There's got to be a mix. I think the mix is different for different people, different leaders, different contexts, but there's definitely got to be both. When I'm talking to leaders, we always cover what are your habits and routines around talking to your people. When and how do you communicate expectations? And that can be for individuals and teams. So, for example, when I was in a senior leadership role, once a month we did a retrospective. What's working, what's not, what's been happening, and what are we going to do going forwards. And that was resetting expectations every month. I would do one-on-one catch-ups with my people, and it would depend. The frequency would depend on how long I'd worked with them and how they were going. But I would always do more at the start. So if I just hired someone new, I do like day one, week one, month one, then probably month 3, month 6 for formal check-ins.
Mm-hmm.
In the calendar, this is a formal forum to talk about how you're going. But then there's got to be the on-the-fly stuff. Absolutely. On my table. And that stuff can be really powerful, more powerful than the formal stuff sometimes. And to do that, you got to spend some time with people. That's kind of the critical part. When I was in sort of open plan office space, at one point I got moved away from my team, and I just made a point that once a week I'd go and sit with them just to see how they were going, and not look over their shoulder, but I was able to give them feedback on the fly, and that stuff's absolutely important. And for leaders, I always say, look, there's probably, if I asked you right now, there's probably a couple of conversations you haven't had that you need to. There just will be. Go and have them. Do it today, do it tomorrow, just do it. Challenge yourself, push yourself a bit. Don't wait around, just go do it. Or else little things, small, snowball into big things.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think this is where it's about building that confidence and that fitness. And we've heard this terminology is about, the more you do it, the more comfortable you get. The more you realize it's not going to end the world, and the more you get the feedback. I'm glad we've had that conversation. I've been meaning to say something, or I'm glad someone's listened to me, that type of thing. And I think, again, we covered off this psychological and psychosocial safety, and all this type of thing is about, we are in a climate at the minute where there's a lot going on for a lot of people, and just having that culture where they can, we can have that conversation with them and say, okay, come on, we make sure we've got to do this by today. What can I do to help you? What's something we can do is an important part of our current way of working now. And I think with the other thing that's coming up here is with the recruitment and you're not going to get people now who may have done that job before. You're not going to be getting your ideal person, that you've been looking for now. So, you haven't got that luxury now of having 30 at the door and filtering them down to 1 or 2 that ticks 99% of the boxes. There's a fair chance now that the people are not going to properly know what to do, how to do it. They won't know the formal and informal rules. And so what's our mechanisms for coaching them along that way as well? Because the other challenge is if you find someone that's just willing to turn up, you don't want them to stay, because if they don't stay, there's not exactly a whole bunch of people coming back in afterwards. And I think this is part of the cultural thing that I think on the longer term. So this is something I'm hearing right across the network, is you've got a lot of people now who are beginning to go, do I really want to move? Is it the right time to move? And they start to question this culture, this leadership, we were having a great conversation last night, about some studies that have come out where, people are saying, these are the reasons I'm leaving. Right. And then they've got businesses saying, why do you think your people are leaving? And the businesses are still talking very transactional. Yeah. Oh, they've left for money. They've left for this and left for that. Yeah. So they've convinced themselves, because I can't do anything about money. So they've had to go. But it's still the people saying, oh, it was the culture. I couldn't talk to my boss. We didn't work well together as a team. And I think this is part of our challenge, is about, if we're not doing this, we're not really feeling the pulse of the business. We're not feeling, are people tired, frustrated, that. So if we're not having these conversations, if we're not doing this, if we're not holding these type of accountability discussions, we're not getting a pulse check of where people are. So I'm building, for me, it's back to this cultural thing. It's about this building a good team. It's about enhancing improvement. It's about understanding where your team feel. And I can imagine, being, just someone would have made that decision to move you away from your team thinking, that's great. That's going to allow Clint to do his job better. That decision made move. But they've totally lost the whole, but hang on a minute. That means now he can't catch up with his people. He can't, he can't see what's going on. So there's a whole miss thing here. So I think this culture, I want to just explore that just a little bit, is about, we've got to understand the part this plays in building a good culture within the workplace.
Yeah. And again, a lot going on there, Kevin. Ideas popping into my head the whole time. One that stood out though was the original research I did on accountability. A couple of thousand, it was with mining, Australian mining, worked with a pretty big business and had data from a couple of thousand mining employees. And one of the really interesting things was that, you do stuff like predictive modeling and, lots of fancy stuff with numbers, but I was interested in what are the outcomes of when accountability is going well, when it's done well. And this was really important because it showed that when leaders are having those conversations, letting people know where they stand, giving them lots of feedback, help them on their journey, and having very clear boundaries around consequences. People were actually more satisfied at work. Their work stress was lower, which was that sort of, for me, great, because it's like, see, it's not about blame and punishment. It makes people, happier and less stressed when they know where they stand. And they were more likely to stay with the business. So the intent to stay, So, and it was mining. So, safety performance was better as well. As you might expect. But I think that discussion, where you're going to is just, again, one of those fundamental challenges. How do we get leaders to motivate people to be engaging, to do all the management stuff plus the leadership stuff, so that people stick around and do their best work? There's no simple answer.
Not an observation, gentlemen. I've been sitting back and listening, and I've got a million questions, but we don't have time for a million, so I'll try and I'll make an observation and ask a question, Clint. So for me, what I'm hearing here, and I don't have a better phrase for this, but what does your leadership toolkit look like? What do you have in that toolkit that will help you to do the things that Kevin's been talking about? And two that pop out clearly as things that you can, in my view only, this is my view only, that you can only develop over a career and over time, is how good or bad is your communication, and to what degree are you an active listener when you're speaking with people, and do you allow yourself and others to share that space to do those things? That's the first thing about how well developed that is. And then the second one, and I don't think this just applies to the great leaders as has been discussed, or the really good ones, is the degree to which you are self-reflective in your practice as a leader. So if you look back at what you're doing and you look at your toolkit and go, oh shit, maybe there's some things I need to do here a little different, or what don't I have in the toolkit that I really need? I think the great leaders ask that question all the time and learn from not just their own mistakes, but interrogate others when things have gone wrong to learn from that process. And the final one, I think, as an orientation, when Kevin said, well, what do we need to do? I think actively supporting people to be lifelong learners in whatever the role they've got, particularly leadership, is critically important, because in the learning process, you will see where mistakes are and you will try and learn from them rather than seeing them as a catastrophic hiccup in a career. So the question to you, Clint, is building those skill sets is an ongoing dilemma for businesses. How can senior leaders help that more efficiently happen without actually saying you must do these things because we think this is what good leadership looks like? So how do you deal with that tension? What would you do if I asked you to do that as my senior learning and development person in our fictitious business, mate.
I work with leadership teams, and the initial engagement can have a whole variety of things, but it's usually, hey, things are not going well. Can you help us? That's pretty normal. And I have an approach. I'm sure there's many, but my approach is usually figure out where a business is at, where it's trying to go. And then I do a 360 review for leaders. I do the 360 process, and we've got a tool built, over 20 odd years, and the accountability stuff is a key feature of that. And we frame that process in terms of adult development and change, and the stages of growth, and how do people make those transitions. And like I said earlier, the feedback is a critical component of that. People need a roadmap and then some idea of where they're at and what, where they need to get to. So I love that 360 process. And, off the back of it, change is a bit slow. It's not, the stuff that needs to change and is going to be challenging, people are not going to go, great, okay, my 360 said I need to delegate more, bang, I'm going to do it, easy, done. That's not real growth. That was probably going to happen anyway. So I think you need some coaching off the back of any sort of process like that. Usually do some workshops, get teams working together a little better, sharing where their challenges are as individuals and as teams. I think that stuff can be really useful. But, it's not easy, Eric. I think there's a bit of a process, and it needs some attention and often some external help. And not everyone will, move and grow, and that's okay. That's just the way it is. And they might not do it now, but they might also down the track. You might be able to plant some seeds that sit there for a year or two before they go, aha, okay, I remember what Clint said that day. Geez, I wish I'd have listened at the time. That's pretty common.
Oh, I think it's a signaling thing too, Clint. If I was running a business and I needed to reach out to you to help me in the business, that sends a very powerful, if not subliminal, message to the team that if we had to go external to work on this stuff, then what is going on in the business, and that has some proactive, I guess, good outcomes, but potentially sets people a bit. Gets their backups because, well, am I a part of the problem? Why haven't I seen that I'm part of the problem? This thing about self-doubt and self-sabotage, and Kevin alluded to this. It's come up in my podcasting quite a lot, that little devil on your shoulder that says you're not good enough, or this isn't great, or you made a mistake, and how, you're not good in that moment. Those self-doubts, I don't think even the best leaders still have those. It's how do you deal with that devil on the shoulder and tell him to get stuffed and go and do the best that you can in a situation? Because and last point here, gents, from me, I guess, is and Kevin's brought this up in multiple podcasts, and I've been thinking about this for a little while, is sometimes a situation demands an immediate response, and you hope to God that you've built enough experience to be able to deal with that and get an outcome that is at least functional. I'm not just necessarily talking, it has to be the best, great outcome. You just need an outcome to progress the work that you're doing. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's, and I have mentioned it a couple of times, but you're going to get a better outcome if the team know what the expectations are. If it's part of it's okay going in and say, yeah, okay, team, this has just happened, and this is what we're doing and everything else. So, and if it's just a one-way thing, or you've never had that conversation before, guess what? People are just not going to know how to react, or they're just not going to be able to buy in. So we're back to this cultural thing again. And I think this is something that's really reinforced is we've started off with this nice word, accountability. Yeah, which is great. And I think we've pulled this apart, but we're starting to understand is about how it just connects with other things as well. It's part, the accountability is part of the toolkit, and it's part of but it's also something that is multifaceted in terms of up and down, sideways, diagonal, outside the organization. So there's also, this whole, how do you have those difficult conversations with people you're working with outside? And, and the more we do this, the more comfortable we get around. And I think I remember a few podcasts where we had, so, leaders start to need to have conversations. Yeah. Just not the go and tell, just go do. This is a conversation. Well, conversation means it's two ways. And I think, Eric, you said, you got to listen sometimes, shut up. You got to listen, because you got to listen about what's coming, and that could be verbal and visual. I could be getting yes, but the body's going nah, and I've got to be able to see that. So I think having that three part, the expectations, the feedback, and those consequences is a real important part of this. And I think for me, it's really reinforced how important, having that understanding about what expectations are, having regular feedback. And we do it on production lines. I need 10 an hour. I've got these great systems that tells me how I'm doing, and that's very hard. It's in the box. What we've got to do is say, we know that work. That's why we do it. That's why you have a visual board in Lean. That's why you have your hand-on lights. That's why you have supervisors that track things during the day, and you give feedback, and the consequences. If you're not going to get that order out the door, what the consequences are. What we're saying is, now we've got to use that in that leadership role about, how to do this. You just got to adapt it and make it the right thing at the right time, and have the right meaning. And it's part of that development, lifelong learning journey that I now learn, my people learn, and we actually learn together. All right, so let's try to wrap that up now in terms of where we are. And I think it's Clint. I think we would definitely get you back on a couple of other topics, because I think that's something that we will pull through. But I think for me, what we like to do really is just have some key takeaways for our listeners and viewers now, Eric. So Clint, we're gonna come to you just about, this is your time here. We've got all these great people who are going to want, right, okay, I now want to hear what Clint's tips are, the get started and that type of thing. And then we will wrap up this session. So here we go. Clint's top tips.
No pressure, mate. No pressure.
Well, I think top tips for me are, as Kevin was getting to before, number one, the leader's greatest tool is conversation. That's the best lever you've got to help people and to be an effective leader. And when it comes to accountability, in my mind, it's about conversations. And the first conversation is around, setting expectations with people. And what are your habits and routines around how you do that? How do you really clarify for people, what's expected of them? Number two, it's those feedback conversations, and doing that in a constructive way with some curiosity as well, asking questions, not just bang, here's the feedback, walk away, there you go, fix it. It's, hey, here's some feedback. What's going on? Help me understand that. So that two-way conversation there. And then the third one is around consequences. If people are not performing or behaving to expectation, there's got to be some consequence for that. And to be honest, 95% of the time, a feedback conversation is consequence enough. But there's got to be those clear boundaries for people. And for individual leaders, it's about, how do you build those things into habits, into your practice, or your formal and informal touch points? And then for businesses, it's what are the structures and mechanisms in place to also support, the ongoing conversations. So I think that's it. That's probably a wrap.
No, that's fantastic, and I think you've really framed that really well, the habits and routines and the conversation. And I think it is about just having that conversation, because I think if we're not used to it, if we haven't got habit routines, we leave it too late. Yeah, you keep saying, oh, I'll have that conversation with Eric, I'll have that conversation, and then it never happens, and the consequences almost make you then, and then it's a very formal discussion. It's really got to that point. So I love the whole building on the conversation. I love the whole that routines and it is about getting out there. We talk about Gemba walks when we talk about things, but it's about then having conversations with people, not the royal wave as you walk through the office and everyone bows and everything else. So I think you've pulled out a really great point there. But I think it's an important tool that we've got. You do have to practice it and you do have to make it work, but it's a great tool because it takes you to personal, team, company and personal level an improvement journey as well, because I'm sure the more confident you are, the more those type of conversations you're gonna have elsewhere as well. So I think you've summarized it brilliantly there, Clint. So thank you very much for that. And I think Eric, it tied in with a number of real key points that keep coming around this whole this leadership and understanding where you are and in terms of the maturity, but it is still about making sure that we know where we're going, because then I can lead with that as well. So I think, Eric, we picked up on some new points here today and some recurring messages as well.
Yeah, I have to agree. One thing that this particular conversation's helped me to get straight in my mind is around more discussions around what does good communication look like in that workspace. And when you're talking about having the conversation, there is an art form to having a conversation, because it has a beginning, middle, and end. And the great leaders know how to mesh that so you don't even know that you're in that loop or in that process. But when it can go wrong, it can go catastrophically wrong. So comms, personal communication, and building that as a key part of your leadership toolkit, if I can use that term again, is a takeaway from this conversation. So Clint, thank you, mate. It's been good.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Clint. And we really appreciate your time. And we'll get back to that brilliant coffee spot as well in the Sunshine Coast sign. And we'll have another discussion and see where it goes from there. So thanks very much to Clint. It's always a pleasure, Eric. And glad we've got these things going again. And we've already got a couple of more planned in the pipeline, which is fantastic.
Yeah, glad to be back. And to end things, I'd like to thank everyone for following the video cast with the Best Practice Network and Talking Leadership TV. Thank you to you, Clint.
Thanks for having me.
And for everyone watching this episode, have a good day, rest of the week, and we'll catch you all on the next podcast. On behalf of Kevin and myself, I'd like to thank our guest, Clint, for sharing his insights. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. A lot more content to come from the Talking Leadership TV Best Practice Network podcast series. Have a great day, rest of the week, and look after yourselves.